Hello everyone, I'm your host Stacey and welcome to episode 3 of How Did We Get Here, where we talk about the craziest cases throughout history and ask ourselves, how did we get here? I know you're not supposed to compliment criminals, but this is a bank heist. And not only does it feel like something out of a movie, but it's probably one of the most thought out and well executed crimes that I have ever heard of. It's January 13th, 2006, and we're at the Banco Rio in Argentina. The bank is surrounded by media outlets and authorities and people with snipers pointed at nearly every entrance possible. We're at the Banco Rio in Argentina on January 13th, 2006. The bank is surrounded by media outlets and authorities and snipers pointed at nearly every entrance possible. The entire country is watching as police carefully try to negotiate with the 4 thieves who are currently holding 23 people hostage inside. Communication seems to be going fine. Thieves are pretty unorthodox about the way they are acting. They begin singing happy birthday to one of the hostages and at one point even request pizza for themselves and everyone inside. 3 hours later, the police decide they're finally going to break in, and when they get inside, they don't find a single one of the criminals. Instead, they find all of the hostages safe, split into 3 different rooms throughout the bank. When they go downstairs, they find a battery pack, tool that they can't necessarily pinpoint, but looks like a jackhammer, a row of toy guns, and 150 of the safety deposit boxes that have been completely opened, seemingly by this tool, by this jackhammer, and they had escaped with over $20 million worth of valuable. When they look around, they also find a note that reads, quote, "In a neighborhood of rich people without weapons or grudges, it's just money, not love," quote. So how did they pull this off? So we have the mastermind of this all, Fernando Araujo. So Fernando was known for having a pretty impulsive personality. He taught martial arts but also grew marijuana for money. He was known as a free-spirited artist and was a little bit wild. Well, Fernando was actually very into bank heist. He was influenced by the Robbery bank heist a few years earlier, where he thought they almost had the perfect heist but messed up when they tried to escape, and he thought he could do better. So a little bit of background: the Robbery bank heist took place on November 17th, 1997. There were 3 armed robbers that broke into Argentina's national bank and took over 6 hostages. When the robbers tried to escape, they used 3 of the hostages as shields to go outside, but when the group of police reacted, they ended up killing one of the suspects, but 2 of the hostages. This gave police a pretty bad reputation in the eyes of all of Argentina, and they had been working to kind of clear their name and prove that they were good at their jobs. Fernando was talking to his friend Sebastian Bolster, and he had this idea of what if the robbers never had to leave the bank and instead they just disappeared. Sebastian agrees that this was a crazy but genius idea, but he didn't really think much of it and didn't take Fernando too seriously. While Sebastian didn't think anything of it, Fernando was pretty serious about this and was actually upset that Sebastian wasn't taking it as seriously as well. However, Sebastian didn't really see the need to pull a bank heist. Both of them have been longtime friends, and they both grew up in the upper middle class suburbs in Buenos Aires. While Fernando had dabbled in some petty crimes, Sebastian had never followed in his path. He had now had a wife and kids and was also a mechanical engineer who even tinkered with some inventions. There was really no need for him to pursue a life of crime because he was very happy with where he was. However, Fernando was in a very bad place mentally in his life. He had recently gone through a breakup and he completely isolated himself from the outside world. He was getting high all the time, was eating very little, and wasn't getting enough sleep. So obviously he became delusional, but he became obsessed with bank robberies more than he already was, and he began consuming every possible media about bank robberies that he could, from articles to documentaries to just made up movies. He was obsessed. And he did this because he wanted to observe other robberies and figure out what mistakes they made. He used that so he could plan out his own perfect heist. In 2004, he came up with what he deemed was the perfect plan. And this is where his idea of the Donatello Project came from. Yes, inspired by the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And so while he deemed this plan to be perfect and genius, he needed his friend Sebastian's engineering skills to actually be able to execute it. Now, Sebastian, when he heard this, he was not happy about the idea at first. One, because he wasn't really interested, but two, he had previously worked at a bank and knew how difficult it actually was for people to rob a bank. However, Sebastian did get swayed when Fernando was able to assure him that no one would get harmed through his plan, and in fact, they wouldn't even be carrying real weapons. So that, combined with Sebastian's also dislike for banks, was very frustrated with the banking system in Argentina. And he was specifically upset with his parents, who entrusted a bank to keep their money, and they had lost it all during Argentina's economic downturns. Now, in fact, this isn't really an isolated instance. Many people in Argentina actually don't trust banks because in 2001, the rate of robbery skyrocketed when Argentina declared bankruptcy. And obviously, when the rate of poverty climbs, so does the rate of crime. So banks were locked down and many people's accounts were raided, causing them to be wiped of all of their savings. That, combined with inflation, the value of the peso was declining very quickly. And so for many people, it didn't even seem like it was worth it because their money would pretty much be worthless. So much so that a lot of people, what they would do is they would take their paycheck, they would get money, straight cash, and exchange it to US dollars. And they would keep it in hiding in their house. And then whenever they needed it later, they would convert it back into pesos because to them that was a lot safer and they knew that they weren't going to lose as much money that way. But once Fernando was able to promise Sebastian that no one would get hurt, he does agree and they get started on their plan. So a little bit of background that explains how this whole tunnel system that they created works is that in Argentina, due to their unpredictable weather, Buenos Aires has a lot of storm drains underneath the streets. So what they plan to do is enter through one of the drains that was close to the bank and then dig a tunnel from there to the bank itself. And they decided that the best way to bypass this bank's alarm system was to never trip it at all. So their plan was to rob the safe deposit boxes in the basement during the day while the place was filled with people. And you're probably thinking, well, why would you do this during the day? That's very risky. Well, that was kind of the whole thing that allowed this plan to work. They decided they were going to stage a fake robbery to cover up their real robbery. And again, that might sound a little bit confusing, but stick with me here. It all makes sense in the end. So Sebastian and Fernando assemble a team of experienced thieves to help them pull off this job. So they hired someone who is referred to as Doc and his associate Ruben Alberto de la Torre. We'll be calling Beto for the rest of the story. They became the fixer and the getaway driver. To their team, they also added Luis Mario Vitez Selanes. He was kind of well-known criminal, and he invested $100,000 into the operation. So with this money, Sebastian gets working on a plan. He gets a safe deposit box in one of the other branches of the Banco Rio, and when he goes to use his deposit box, he notes the name and orders a few boxes himself so that he could test out different ways to be able to break open the safe. After a few tests, he settles on this jackhammer-like tool where it was strong enough to punch through the box, but was also able to be kept at a reasonable noise level that it didn't alarm people. He also designed it in a way that it could be disassembled and carried in pieces to the bank, and where they could assemble it there and disassemble it again. Now that they have a strategy to get to the bank and then break open the safe boxes, they also needed to figure out how they were planning to get the valuables out of the bank. So what they came up with is that they were going to go back to the drains, which were filled with water, and they were planning to use Zodiac boats, which seemed like a good idea. However, the water levels in the drain were too low for them to actually hold up the loaded boats. So Sebastian decides to build a wooden dam in his shop where he could disassemble and reassemble it when they were in the storm drains over the next several days. This made it so there was enough water to actually carry the boats in and out. So now we're on the morning of the heist, and there was now a total of 7 men who are a part of this operation. And of course, as any criminal would do, they meet up in the morning for coffee. Then they all disperse and start working on the beginning stages of their heist. So Sebastian goes into the storm drains and makes his way to the bank underground. Julian Zalocheveria drove the getaway car to their agreed meeting spot. Another anonymous man who we do not know the name of and Luis drive a stolen car to the garage under the bank, and everyone else drives another car to the bank itself. So Beto and Doc head into the bank, and Beto is waving around a toy gun. Of course, seeing a weapon, everyone inside the bank drops to the floor. Fernando leaves the car outside of the bank, and that becomes their fake getaway car. This was so that they could trick the police into thinking that they know what vehicle they're planning to use to get away. So Fernando walks into the bank in a disguise that I'm surprised nobody found suspicious. He goes in with a blonde wig, sunglasses, a baseball cap, and a ski mask. Meanwhile, Sebastian is in the tunnels that he digged up, and once he reaches the end, he waits underneath the bank. So Doc goes to the basement and breaks down the wall separating the bank from the tunnels to let in Sebastian to help with the robbery. So while they're assembling the jackhammer, Luis and Beto have already isolated all the hostages into separate rooms, and Luis takes on the fake persona, Walter, and he's the one communicating with the police. So now police think that they are dealing with a robbery gone wrong and that they had already caught the thieves inside. Luis was even releasing a few hostages at a time to make police believe that they could negotiate. So while all this is happening upstairs, in the basement, we have Doc and Sebastian who are collecting all the valuables. So they had this planned out to have 2 hours to get in and out. They were able to assemble the jackhammer within 20 minutes, and then they spent another hour and a half opening up all the deposit boxes. So once Luis gets a signal from Fernando to go downstairs, he tells the cops to order a pizza. That's when he completely cuts them off, and police are no longer hearing from Walter, and he goes downstairs to help them stuff all of the goods into the bags. So now while Beto, Luis, and Sebastian are putting everything into bags, Fernando and Doc have bottles of bleach that they are spraying all over the room and wiping everything down to completely get rid of any possible DNA. And if you think that's thorough, they then pull out a bag of hair from a barbershop floor and just start spreading it around the room. That way they can confuse police, because now not only do police have no DNA from the robbers, but they also have false DNA leads. And again, this is the type of stuff that I read this case and I'm like, who thinks of that? You have too much time on your hands. That like Truly, to be able to plan all this to T, you have too much time on your hands. So once they do all this, they exit back through the tunnel and they clean up any possible evidence that could possibly lead back to them. And then they take a large, heavy cabinet, move it so it's covering the wall, the broken wall with the tunnel. They then all pile into the Zodiac boats and the motor breaks down. But of course, they were not going to fail. Oh no, Fernando had actually brought paddles because he thought of every possibility that could have possibly gone wrong, and there was no way that was going to happen. So they end up paddling away through the tunnels to get to the getaway van. And of course, they already had a pulley system set in place that they had already tested and used that to haul the bags up from the storm drains, and then got themselves out and drove off in the getaway van while police were still thought that they had them surrounded within the bank. So by the time that police had finally stormed into the bank, the group of thieves were already at home watching police from their TV and apparently eating pizza. Of course, they finally got their pizza. It's funny because everybody thought they really had them, not knowing that this group was 10 steps ahead of everybody. The media live stream was actually delayed by 30 minutes because they did not want the thieves to know when police were actually going to come in. But little did they know, these thieves were already long and gone, even with that 30-minute delay. So Sebastian, being the smart one, realizes that the credit cards were pretty much useless to them. Not only because that they could be tracked once they're used, but also because they could be easily canceled. So he gets in his car and he drives all throughout the city, as far away from the gang's route as he possibly could. The reason why this was so genius is because not only was there now no clear trail towards the robbery, but it also created a bunch of false leads. Every time that a random person passing by would see the credit card and pick it up and try to use it, police would have to hunt them down to make sure that they weren't involved. And of course, in all these cases, they weren't. So police became tired and frustrated because now they had realized that they had been publicly humiliated on live TV. So when I first heard about this story, I asked, okay, well, why do I know it? If this is such a perfectly well thought out, brilliant crime, how did they get caught? Because clearly someone got caught if we know all their names and their plan and how it went. And I would love to say that the way they got caught was just as brilliant as the way this whole thing was planned. But unfortunately, it is the exact opposite. So after the robbery, Beto came home to his wife, Alicia, and bragged to her about how he and his friends were the ones who robbed Banco Rio. So Beto actually had a long history of cheating on his wife, Alicia. Can we see where this is going? Yeah, absolute dumpster fire. One day, Beto realizes that some of the valuables had actually gone missing, and Beto and Alicia had argued about where the missing valuables had gone. Well, Miss Alicia had also found out that Beto was still cheating on her. So a few weeks later, Beto was out driving with his mistress, with his side piece, and apparently he was trying to flee the country with her. He gets pulled over and he is arrested right then and there. It turns out that Alicia had called police and told them the story of what Beto told her. She then identified Beto, Fernando, Sebastian, Luis, and Julian. She told police that she actually saw them working on the getaway van in her garage. She didn't end up pointing fingers at Doc or the other anonymous thief because she had never actually seen them in her house. So, of course, they were all arrested and sentenced. Beto was sentenced to 15 years. Fernando was sentenced to 14 years. Julian was sentenced to 10 years. And Sebastian had the shortest sentence with 9 years. However, most of them did not actually end up completing the full sentence, and they got out early. I'm pretty sure most, if not all of them, are free today. Louise, however, had a little bit of a different situation. So as we established, Louise had a past of a lot of different crimes, and he was sentenced to a total of 14 years for everything combined. But he and his lawyers were able to find a loophole. Because he was not a citizen of Argentina, he was able to get his sentence cut in half as long as he left the country. So in 2013, he was deported and only ended up serving 4 years in prison. So as far as I know, it seems like Doc and the other anonymous thief were never actually caught, obviously, because we don't know their real names. So good for them, I guess. So that is how eventually their perfect plan came tumbling down. And so many people kind of blamed Alicia for this because it was like it could have been the most perfect heist. Like, I don't blame her. I think this was Beto's fault to begin with, because why would you willingly admit to a crime? And you could say, she was his wife, but he obviously had a history of treating her poorly and cheating on her. And this, if I had to guess, the relationship was probably toxic just based on what we know. But that's none of my business. But like, why would you admit to a crime to someone and then like piss them off? Even though Alicia did take them into jail, we kind of have to thank her, because if she hadn't, we would have never known about what really happened at Banco Rio, and we wouldn't have this story. So honestly, give her a round of applause or at least a small round of applause. This was such a thorough and perfectly executed plan. Imagine how thorough and perfectly executed the crimes are that we don't know about, and we'll probably never know about, because that's how clean they were in making sure that they were never traced. I'm just saying. But thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode of How Did We Get Here? Hope you enjoyed hearing the story just as much as I did. And if you want to know more, there's actually a really interesting article from the GQ back in 2020 where they did interview a few people from the Buenos Aires bank heist. So if you want to hear more and even want to hear the perspective of some of the thieves, I definitely recommend giving it a read in your free time. But thank you so much. Be sure to tune in next week and tell me what you think.